The year 1619 is one of the most important and historical events in America's history. It ushered in an era that would forever change the fabric of a fragile society on the verge of collapse. It would usher in a system of racial divide based on a perception of inferiority solely on a person's skin color. It was in 1619 that a ship landed at Point Comfort, Virginia, with a precious cargo of enslaved Africans. They were captured from Angola, Africa, put aboard a slave ship, and survived the deadly and horrific journey through the Middle Passage from Africa to the Virginia colony. The first Africans were not slaves because slavery did not exist. They were treated as indentured servants without a contract, and most were freed by 1650. Project 1619 Incorporated, a nonprofit organization in Hampton, Virginia, is credited as the grassroots organization that started the movement to correct the narrative of the first enslaved Africans that for hundreds of years have been covered up with mistruths and false narratives.
You know, when they talk about the first landing of the Africans here, this is not the first landing. This is the first enslaved people's landing in America, 1619, in Hampton, Fort Monroe, Virginia. But it's not the first coming of the Africans to America, for what so-called America is. It's not the first. They have, the bodies and artifacts from Africa that was here in America and the so-called Americas before what they call the tribal people came here. So when you're talking about African people, you're talking about everybody on the planet. I don't care, the people call themselves European now, Asian, Hispanic, whatever. Your DNA comes from this self-same place as everybody else. So no matter what you call yourself, you're still African. And it wasn't called Africa from the beginning, it was called Alkebulan. The birthplace of all humanism, of all humans, or the Garden of Eden. And that's what it meant. And so those Angolans were migratory. They were some of the baddest agriculturalists on the planet. They were some of the war factions. You know, every community, every tribal community had a safety net, from, outside interference. Not that they were going out starting trouble, but they were defending their own. And the Angolans was a mixture of people. Now you're talking about the different empires or the different confederations or the different provinces of the West Coast, like Ghana, Benin, Mali, Senegal. All of them belonged to one empire at one point in time. So all of those people, groups that came together, now somebody centralized them and said, okay, they're Angolans. So all the slaves that were taken, all the people that were kidnapped and taken to the transatlantic slave trade was from Angola, and that's not true. Talking about Africa, it's touchy. Like I said, it's the beginning of humankind. And originally, our people weren't religious. Our people were spiritual. And spirituality and religion are two different things. The more I've dealt with religion, I found that religion is dealing with interpretations. And interpretation is what man say that the truth is, and the truth is what the Most High say it is. So if I'm leaning to certain people as opposed to developing that spiritual connect with the Creator myself, then I'm gonna get secondhand information. And they did have tribal religions. They have cultural religions. But all of those things was tied into what men desired to do, mingled with some truism, some real spiritual stuff. But it got distorted, especially when they started dealing with other factions that come in. Now, when Christianity took a big step into our being in Africa, well, those people that came in pushing Christianity was the same people that were oppressing us. And some of the truths that some of the things that they instilled on us to be the truth wasn't really the truth. And if you didn't have an intimate relationship with the Most High for yourself, then you're going to get caught up, which a lot of them did. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion learns how to read, the glory will always go to the hunter. So that means that other people have always been writing our story. That's why the word history, his story, is not always true. So we need to have our story told by our people to help to bring some true light to this whole divide, because that's what it is.
Between 1618 and 1620, over 50,000 Africans were kidnapped from the central west coast of Africa in Angola. They were taken from their villages of Nganda and Kabasa. They were kidnapped by Portuguese soldiers along with mercenary African warriors. The Africans were marched 150 miles from their villages to the Angolan capital port city of Luanda. Once they reached the port, they were put into dungeons and camps to wait to be sold to slave traders and transported to unknown destinations. Before being loaded into the belly of a slave ship, they were stripped of clothing and branded with a hot iron.
This is where our ancestors landed. This is where the African imprint on America began. And that was a story that was not being told. What we were being taught was the Jamestown story, that the first Africans arrived at Jamestown and everything happened at Jamestown, neglecting the history here at Fort Monroe. I started teaching this history in 1994, and it took me many years to get people to understand that what they were hearing or what they were taught was a false narrative. So we've been telling that story for many years. When we go back and we look at the first landing here at Point Comfort, which was 400 years ago, we call it the accidental landing because Virginia never intended to import Africans from Africa. If it wasn't for that accidental landing, we do not know when they would have landed here and how that would have changed the course of history. Because when we go back and look at England, England had outlawed slavery. When the Virginia colonists arrived here, slavery was illegal. So the idea of you enslaving Africans was not contrary to what the legal law was. Those first Africans were described as servants. So when we go back and we look at the census from 1624, they're listed in the census as servants. They're not listed as blacks, they're not listed as Negro. They're not listed, the only thing they're listed as is servants. So that's where a lot of our history comes from. If you're calling our ancestors servants, then they can't be slaves. When you go back and you look at the terminology, the definition of slave, it means that you are going to be held in bondage for life. But that's not the story here in Hampton, because we have a unique history of those 32 Africans that were documented by the census in 1620. We know that all, or just about all, of those first Africans eventually gained their freedom. So how can you call people who gained their freedom slaves? So that was another story that we wanted to get told out there about the true definition of those Africans. We don't call them slaves, we call them enslaved, because when you go to Africa, there were no slaves in Africa. When you went to Africa, you kidnapped Africans to be enslaved. So when they arrived here, we said that they were enslaved Africans. So that was one of the misconceptions that we wanted to tell about the first Africans. There were a lot of misconceptions about whether the ship that brought the Africans here were a Dutch ship. Through documentation, we have determined that it was flying a Dutch flag. because it had gone to the Netherlands to get a marquee to attack Spanish and Portuguese ships. So although it arrived here flying a Dutch flag, it was not a Dutch ship. Through documentation, we found out that it was an English captain, an English crew sailing out of England, who brought the first Africans here because when they were attacked in the port of Mexico, the only nearest English port or safe haven that they could take them to was here in Virginia, because they knew the governor was favorable to slavery and piracy, because he was a co-partner in a ship called the Treasure that he had routinely sent out on the high seas to pirate Spanish and Portuguese ships of their cargo. There has been a false narrative about Jamestown since 1607 when the 3 ships arrived. The story that they do not tell you in a lot of situations is that the 3 ships landed in present-day Virginia Beach. On April 26, 1607, they were attacked by the natives. They got back on their ships and they crossed what we call the Hampton Roads Channel, and they came here to Hampton, present day, or at that time it was called the Kicquetan Village. They stayed at the Kicquetan Village for 2 weeks, which a lot of people will not tell you. The Indians fed them, they welcomed them. During that 2-week period, the settlers on these 3 ships had sent out excursions or ships to locate another area to create a settlement. Their instructions were to find an inland location that would be protected from the Spanish ships. And people don't realize that they had sent scout ships all the way up to Maryland. They had sent scout ships all the way up to Richmond to find the most suitable location for Virginia's first settlement. If we look at history, we found out that Jamestown was not settled until May 13, 1607. But nobody wants to tell you, well, what happened in the 2 weeks between April 30th, when they arrived here in Hampton, and May 13th, when they decided to create a settlement at Jamestown. So those are 2 weeks of missing history that people don't know about or they won't tell you about. But we know it was a hospitality here in Hampton of the Algonquin Indians that made them feel home, fed them, helped teach them the culture of the land, helped teach them how to grow crops before they even arrived at Jamestown. And then we find out that they go to Jamestown, which was a swamp. It was mosquito infected, and they called this place the first permanent settlement in Virginia. John Rolfe was the secretary of the Virginia colony. He was here at Fort Monroe on August 25th of 1619. His job was to report back to England everything that happened in the Virginia colony. But for some reason, he did not report back to England until January of 1620, that he observed the landing of 20 and odd Africans from a Dutch ship. And it leads us to suspect that he was trying to shroud and hide the history of the first enslaved Africans, because most people can count past 20. By saying 20 and odd, he did not want anybody to know how many Africans were on the ship. But we go back and we look at a census from 1620, March of 1620, that said there were 32 Africans in the Virginia colony. And we know that only 2 ships arrived between August and March of 1620, and they were the White Lion and the Treasure. The only way those 32 Africans could have come here were on those 2 ships. So that was part of the controversy that John Rolfe created many years ago by not telling us the true story of how many Africans were on that ship. So through extended documentation and research, over the past 20 years, we have come up with the fact that there were actually 32 Africans on that ship. This is where the famous story about Angela comes from. We know that Angela arrived around August the 30th of 1619 on a ship called the Treasurer. And that's how she became famous and familiar with the Jamestown colony. When we go back and we look at the documentation from John Roth and others who said 20 and odd, and we compare that to research done in the past 20 or 30 years, and we compare that to the history of Jamestown, we come to the understanding that nobody wanted to know that Africans had landed here and how they were going to be treated. It was like they were trying to shroud or hide the history of the first Africans. So when we look at Jamestown, we talk about Jamestown's legacy. Jamestown has a rich legacy of the first English settlement here in the Virginia colony, but they shrouded the history of the first Africans. And for the past 390 years, they've used that false narrative of the first enslaved Africans for tourism. They wanted to exploit our ancestors to ensure that people of non-color would go to Jamestown and hear a story about how Africans were subservient to their society. So there's a long story and history of why people have not told the truth, and that's another reason why Project 1619 Incorporated has come along to tell the people the true story of our ancestors. When we walk these grounds, these are the grounds of our ancestors and not Jamestown. And now we find out that people have not going to Jamestown in the numbers that they were, that we're seeing an increase in tourism attraction and visitation here at Fort Monroe, because we have proved to them that this is the land of their ancestors. And we always encourage people to come here as part of their pilgrimage to learn the true history of their ancestors. Most of that began right here on these grounds at Fort Monroe. When we did our commemoration here in 2019, a lot of people said, well, they were not the first Africans in America. And we had to go back and define when did America begin? Because people were saying, well, you know, there were Africans in Florida in the early 1500s, and we tried to tell them that Florida was a Spanish colony. We became an English colony. So when we look at the first landing of Africans in English North America, it was here at Point Comfort in 1619. We call this the modern history, because if you want to go back to the beginning of time, we have proven that Africans or people of color were on every continent first. So these other countries, China, Russia, are finding these skeletons of people who are now Africans, and they were the first people on their land. There are people here who have written books that says the first Africans here in Virginia arrived 57,000 years ago, and that eventually they merged with the Native Americans, or in some instances they merged with the Asians, and the blacks and the Asians became Native Americans. So there's a lot of stories out there, but getting to the bottom line is still a process that we need to further investigate.
In 2019, Fort Monroe commemorated the 400th anniversary of the landing of the first enslaved Africans in English North America. In 2011, President Barack Obama declared portions of Fort Monroe a national monument and the official landing site of the first enslaved Africans.
Over 100 sites have been set aside as national monuments, everything from the Statue of Liberty to the Grand Canyon. So today, I am continuing that proud tradition by adding another monument to the list. Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, has played a remarkable role in the history of our nation. It was the site of the first slave ships to land in the New World. I want to thank everybody who's here for the great work that they've done, and I thank the Commonwealth of Virginia for giving us this opportunity to appreciate the remarkable history of their state, but also of this country. So with that, I'm going to sign this bill. or executive order. There you go.
Chattel slavery and antebellum slavery did not exist in Virginia colony in 1619. The first enslaved Africans created an undefined precedent on how they would be treated. They were defined as servants in 1624 census. Many of the first enslaved Africans gained their freedom by 1650, but their legal status and their descendants' status would gradually change to legalized slavery.
I want to stress clearly that we are at ground zero, period, for the arrival / landing of the Jamestown bunch, as I call them, Captain Christopher Newport, Captain John Smith, and others at what they came to call the land known as Old Point Comfort today. They called it Good Comfort. That was 1607. I will be remiss if I didn't point out clearly, as I always make sure I do, that there were people living here, indigenous people. They'd been here for 12,000 plus years or more. That's where this history begins here. We can't explain exactly how those indigenous people got here, but they were here. The area was occupied. So we have indigenous people, the English seafaring colonists that I mentioned, that sowed the seeds for the development of what we would call American civilization. The next pivotal thing was, of course, the enslaved African landing in 1619. So I want to make clear that there was a chronological progression. We can't just jump in and say that here were enslaved Africans. And I want to stress also that the history of the African peoples in what became the United States of America is not simply about slavery. It is not simply about slavery. I'm not going to sit here and focus solely on slavery. I'm going to speak clearly and focus on those African involuntary immigrants, as I would speak about any group of individuals and their history, which is multifaceted. If it was a matter of labor, why were only the Africans enslaved ultimately? And why not have, as individuals who were ultimately made chattel property, likewise? But the big four-letter word to keep in mind is race. It was because of race and the color of their skin. Racism was not new to the Virginia colony. It had a long history. We know some of the history that's represented in the play by William Shakespeare of Othello, the dirty swarthen Moor, the whole notion, the curse of Ham. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds other than to say that racism provided the foundation for what ultimately happened to those enslaved Africans. We know that they were traded for foodstuff, for victuals, when they arrived. And I always say, of course, that the enslaved Africans landed here just as you speak of the Pilgrims. They landed at Plymouth Rock a year later. We know that among those who were traded, if you will, you can use the word bought, were Anthony and Isabella. If you go to the visitor center in Hampton, you will see a representation of Isabella, who represents African women. Anthony and Isabella were procured by William Tucker. He was the commandant of the fort at that point in time. Fort Algernon would be constructed later on, but he was in charge of making sure that any vessels that arrived would have to stop. You can call it a port of entry, per se. Anthony and Isabella, became his servants. We know that others ended up going up the James River to Jamestown. They would go to Charles City. They would go to plantations like the Flower Dew 100. So we didn't have a great number of those enslaved Africans remaining in Kecoughtan, as it was called then, ultimately Hampton. We do know that Anthony and Isabella were essentially house servant-like individuals, though they did do field work as well. We know, as most individuals have come to understand, that they bore a child, William Tucker, in 1623. And William Tucker is the first documented African child born in the Virginia colony. We have evidence that there was another African child born slightly before or about the same time, but we don't have documentation to prove that. So we will stick with William Tucker. And the records reflect that because he was baptized. We can prove that. And we do not have a history of what actually happened to or with him. We do believe that Anthony and Isabella were given their freedom, if you will, around 1635, and we believe they moved to Kent County. We don't have a great deal of information about them. So that's instructive, because you found that you had individuals who were not, at that point in time, enslaved for life or made chattel slaves. Let's put it that way. It would be 20 more years, however, before the Virginia colony decided in 1661 that you can legally enslave, according to the law, individuals and make them chattel property. I emphasize the chattel property piece because that meant that it was just like you're owning a book, owning an animal, owning land, and that property was yours to do with it as you wished. You could take it out of the area and it was still your property. That would be decided with the Dred Scott decision later on. I don't want to get into the whole Dred Scott decision, which said further that Africans, Negroes, had no rights that anyone was bound to respect. You can take your book, you can take your animal, you can take your Negro, you can take your African, your human being anywhere you wanted to. So that arrived legally in 1661 in Virginia. It was a evolutionary process, as I said earlier, from the enslaved African landing, indentured-like servitude, John Punch, first indication. That is not to say that there were not some individuals who were probably being held for life too and not being given their freedom. The first instance wherein we have a real clear court case where a holder of an indentured servant's contract refused to release that individual was as a result of an African man by the name of Anthony Johnson, who held the indentured servant contracts of a number of individuals, some Europeans and some Africans. He lived on the Eastern Shore, Anthony Johnson. He refused to give one of his indentured servants, a man by the name of Casor, C-A-S-O-R, he refused to give him his freedom at the end of his indentured servitude period. And it went to court. And Anthony Johnson, ironically, an African, was the first who refused to honor an indentured servant's contract. And that is just ironic. It's just something that you would not have expected to happen. Anthony Johnson's family, by the way, ultimately moved further north. They moved into Maryland as well. You need to look at the lifestyle and what they did while they were indentured servants and ultimately enslaved, raising tobacco as a cash crop and then cotton and that kind of thing. Also, the miscegenation piece, and that they were actually living with pretty much European indentured servants, and that became a serious problem. And you look at the colors of our skin today, that's where it began back then.
1619 represents the beginning of race-based bondage in which will become the United States of America. The landing of the first enslaved Africans at Point Comfort is one of America's most dreadful and painful events in its history. The transition from human bondage to legalized slavery was the beginning of systematic racism and oppression of people of color that has permeated the social and legal fabric of this land for 400 years. The journey to freedom has been long. The fight for social justice is never ending. Those inalienable rights are still a dream deferred.